we can drastically improve these patients' lives today and every day after that as well. So, welcome to the future, the smart city. Now, that is a deliberate piece of marketing for a very specific reason, which I'll get to later on. First of all, I'm going to introduce myself slightly more fully so that you can get a sense of who I am, and then I'll ask you some questions about who you are as well, so that I can adjust my talk accordingly. So, as Em's introduced me, I'm a lecturer in health geography and also director of something called the GeoHealth laboratory. So as a lecturer in health geography, I'm interested in how places and people interact. So does where you live impact on your health? And the answer is usually yes. So I see smart cities as a way to start to answer some of these quite tricky questions about how much basically the place in which you live impacts on your own personal health. So that might be using things, various computer technology, various algorithms, big data, all these types of things. So I kind of call myself a geospatial scientist, which is much better than what I get called by my significant other after having yet another stimulating academic debate. But that's a different lecture entirely. I also interact with school kids and teachers. I'm an innovation champion in the department, and I also manage the internship program in geography. So that gives you hopefully a better idea of who I am. So the previous slide, of course, was me as a baby, wondering which came first, the chicken or the egg. And I still haven't quite solved that very vexing problem. So what I want to find out now from all of you is basically who all you are, if that makes sense. It doesn't really as an English sentence, but that's okay. So how many of you, by show of hands, are, I guess, students, either at school or at university, or something like that? Okay. How many of you are teachers, or lecturers, or stuff like that, by show of hands? Okay, a few of you. Who works for local or regional government or the civil service in some way, shape or form? Okay. And the other category I'm going to use is interested members of the public. Who would put themselves in that category? Okay, so that's almost everyone. What about All Blacks fans? Any of those in the room? Can't see any hands at all. Well, that's very unfortunate, isn't it? Okay, so thank you for doing that. That helps me to sort of bend the talk slightly. Okay, so I want to talk about basically 3 questions. Firstly, so when I wrote these questions, I thought I was being quite clever because I got to frame the argument. It actually transpires that answering the first question is incredibly difficult. So I sort of shot myself in the foot in some ways in that regard. So the first question is, what actually is a smart city? What do we think a smart city is? Then, once we've sort of loosely defined what that might be, do we think that that concept is actually an opportunity or a threat? And I'll talk a little bit about that using some practical examples. And then, could a smarter city actually improve your health? And again, I'll use a very specific research project to try and demonstrate what I think the answer to that question might be. Okay, so first of all, what actually is a smart city? So as I've alluded to, this is actually quite a tricky question to answer. But I'm going to start you on a journey, a sort of a short story. First of all, why the focus on cities in the first place? So there's sort of become an increasing obsession with cities, and particularly with smart cities. So historically, cities are places where there's a great pull effect, I guess, for the hope that you find employment, that you might learn something new at places like this. That the idea that we're crammed in more closely together allows us the opportunity to connect with each other, to socialize, if you're that type of a person. And just generally for more opportunity, for wealth creation, all those kinds of things. So that's kind of the historical perspective and why cities matter. The other reason that's sort of summed up in this quote by someone called Anthony Townsend is that the global population has actually become more urban than rural. Okay, you'll have to excuse my Northern Irish accent when I pronounce certain words. I don't have a dictionary, unfortunately. So the quote says that at some point in one of China's coastal cities or in an African slum, a young man or young woman gets off a train, a plane, an automobile, and they forever shift the balance towards cities. And so the human population now is more urban than it is rural. And that happened sometime around 2007, 2008. So these are the yellow line is the UN population estimates for the proportion of people who live in urban areas. So you can see in 1950, I don't remember it particularly well, but about 30% of the population was urban back then. So here's where we get the 50%, and then outwards to 2050, we forecast that about 2/3 of global population will be urban. So that's more and more reasons for this focus towards cities, that they're going to be the places where more and more people live, and so we need to understand how they actually work. If I move on now to what actually is a smart city, the kind of trite, simplistic answer is it depends who you ask as to what the answer you get back is. Okay, so this is a word cloud of basically the internet definition of everything that falls into the category of smart cities. Fantastically unhelpful, really, because it's full of slightly random words, mainly smart and city, which is kind of where we were at the start anyway, and kind of urban services, things like that, which again sort of reiterate where we were in the first place. So actually part of the problem is there's not really a single quick and easy definition to what is a smart city. So what I'm going to do is to try and simplify it a bit more and to look at it from a few different directions so you start to get a sense of what it is. So if you think of large corporate organizations and a kind of a top-down, management-driven approach to life, smart cities are essentially a way of these large companies telling stories about their products and services. So it's essentially a sales pitch around selling more and more of a particular product and service to a city. Again, you can see there's particular buzzwords associated with, this is the corporate definition of smart cities. I think this is taken from the IBM website. And so words like insights, analytics, optimization, these type of words are associated with that type of definition. Somewhat confusingly, inserting the word smart in front of everything that you do anyway is one way in terms of defining the smart city in this worldview. So I'm not sure what smart traffic is. I don't think there is such a thing necessarily. I just don't like traffic. But basically they've inserted either the word smart or smarter in front of everything that we do anyway. So IBM actually trademarked the words smarter cities. So they have the rights. So these are all registered trademarks of IBM. So that's the kind of the top-down corporate view. We'll solve your problems and also give us some money for that privilege. So the other way, if you like, is from the bottom up. So the citizens, the general public, start to build various sensors, build various instruments, and they solve problems which they find important. So that's people like you, essentially. come up with a solution to a particular problem. So this is the idea of the citizen scientist, and there's a definition up there, which again is the idea that a member of the general public starts to engage in some form of scientific work, usually in collaboration with someone like me, and then science gets done in collaboration, and we find solutions to particular problems. So again, this is taken from that definition, and again you can see that citizen and science kind of comes out quite strongly there. So we've looked at top down and we've looked at kind of bottom up. So you can see there's slight differences in emphasis. One is much more about sales, marketing, money, and the other is about solving specific local problems. This then is probably closer to what the environment is actually like. My favorite thing about this diagram is that they've managed to insert another version of the word smart, so it's smarter, smart cities, as if it wasn't getting ridiculous. So smarter, smart cities. So the top down is everything in blue, and that's what I've talked about in terms of optimizing specific flows of things like traffic. The citizen science is the bottom up. So there's a product here called the Smart Citizen, which is an environmental air quality type sensing device that you can buy, and you can deploy that in your back garden, wherever you want, and then that data is opened up for people like me to use. I would say that in Christchurch, we're probably somewhere in the middle here. So that's kind of where the general public and the local government have some kind of conversation about what problems they want to solve. And that is potentially the sweet spot in smart cities, that actually citizens are consulted in some way, shape or form about how to improve services, and they actually have some say over what problems get solved. I'll come back to that point slightly later. Has anyone ever heard of Street Bump? Yeah, so that's an app that sits on your mobile phone, and basically every time your car goes over a pothole, that registers, and then that gets sent to the city council. You can imagine in Christchurch that would, that's kind of not a very useful innovation in some ways, because Christchurch, of course, has the flattest roads known to man. Okay. So hopefully you're starting to get a sense of the kind of different angles that people are coming from. What I've tried to do as well is to come up with what does this actually look like in real life. So this is taken from my Instagram feed, which is a picture sharing web service. This essentially is the building blocks of the smart city. So it's actually not that complicated in some ways. So you have things like smartphones here, various types of sensors for air quality, for luminosity, for humidity, temperature, whatever it happens to be. You plug that into some sort of sensor box, which is solar powered, hopefully. It didn't actually work that well here, ironically. Then you have some form of computer. That's a Raspberry Pi, which is a credit card sized computer. And wearables as well. So that little thing there is an accelerometer, which I was wearing until I broke it for the second time last week. I'm not actually sure where it is. I still haven't found it. My colleague lost one in Wellington. If you're up there, if you can find it, that would be really helpful. And so you connect all these things together, and the data from the different devices you connect in some way, shape or form, and hope to learn something new. The headphones, by the way, are noise cancelling, which is a smart solution to construction noise, or on an airplane as well. Completely unrelated to smart cities, but in there anyway. The other thing that concerns me with a lot of the jargon and the literature and the material around smart cities is actually that it's surprisingly devoid of any reference to people, which kind of seems somewhat obvious in that cities are full of people. And so there's a kind of assumptions that these sort of generic solutions can just be rolled out across any city in the world, and the people just accept that unquestioningly, and it works perfectly. So what this is, and one of my students has helpfully drawn these maps, is the proportion of Christchurch residents with tertiary qualifications, so people with degrees. And you can see, of course, that the pattern is unequal. There's differences across space. And so the idea that everyone in a city experiences whatever smart city solution, in my view, is not necessarily that helpful. And so there needs to be more effort to take into account the underlying patterns of inequality within a city. And that hasn't quite happened just yet. This map here is the percentage of Christchurch residents with PhDs, so people like me, from about 1 in 10 to about 1 in 20 of each of those areas. So that's the people who have lots of bits of paper but lack common sense, if you want to go to any of those places. That's a joke as well, by the way. Okay, so the idea is that smart people is again quite a loaded term, depending on if you're in or out of that category. So here's my version, if you like, of what actually makes up a sensing city. So this is the recipe. So it might seem obvious to state this, but you need a city and some people. Actually, some of the smart cities, so there's one called Masdar, failed at the second hurdle in that it couldn't actually attract enough people to the city, so it doesn't really work as a smart city because it's massively depopulated. You also need some kind of hardware, software, computers, whatever it happens to be, sensors to provide you with data. I've called it a smattering of education. That may be formal or informal, but you need some way of understanding the data that is coming from the infrastructure. And then a pinch of creativity or innovation. So people who are prepared to take the raw ingredients and turn that into some kind of solution for the city. So the end result, hopefully, is a solution to some relevant problem. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about smart cities. So the next part of the talk is probably the area that I run into the most difficulty with, because there's the widest range of opinions on this particular issue. So is the smart city an opportunity, or is it actually a threat? Is it actually a risk? The answer, by the way, just a spoiler alert, is not quite that clear-cut. But I'll show you some examples and hopefully try and sway you one way or the other. So I've shown this picture before when I've talked about this. This is from a magazine cover. This technology, by the way, does exist. So it projects an image onto your wrist. And it's basically the same as your smartphone, if you think about it. So the key thing here, I think, is, again, it depends on who you ask as to what answer you get back. So because I'm generally a personality that likes new stuff and gets excited by that kind of thing, I automatically look for opportunity. If you're Scottish or not particularly excited about new things, you may automatically see. That's a joke as well. I'm sorry. Anyone Scottish? Scottish people, fantastic. Yeah. So that was a joke. So again, a personality to a large extent determines, I think, how you view these kinds of things. This may be fantastic or terrifying, again. So what I'm going to argue with this stuff is that actually a lot of the things that we think are threats or risks, in many respects the genie is already out of the bottle and it's sort of too late. But you may or may not realize that until I start showing Hands up if you have a smartphone of any description or a mobile phone. Okay, so pretty much all of you in the room should be aware that you're being tracked by a cell phone company, but you may not have actually seen that data, right? So everyone kind of knows it goes on, but until you see it, then your reaction might change. What about, has anyone got a credit card or an FPOS card? Yeah, everyone, okay. So again, that data can be linked to a location and a time and an amount of money. And I'll show you my credit card details and spending habits in just a second. And the PIN number, yes. I'll not give you that. So I'll delve into a small subsection of the smart cities called the quantified self. This is essentially when we collect data on ourselves. Some of you may actually do that deliberately, for others it may be more accidental. So as I was saying, you get some sort of wearable device or a smartphone, and that produces data. It may be your sleep patterns, how much you move, your heart rate, whatever it happens to be. We pull that all into some kind of database. You may or may not have control over that data. A company may hold that data. You then do some sort of clever analysis on that data. So working out how long you slept or how far you walk. And then it kind of falls over at this point where a lot of this stuff is quite trivial in that the smart devices at the minute tell us things that we kind of already know. So the thing that I broke told me how much sleep I got every night. I don't really need a device to tell me if I didn't sleep that night. I kind of already know that instinctively because I'm quite grumpy. No, more grumpy than usual. So here's what it looks like in terms of actual cell phone data. So this thing here is the accelerometer in your phone. And what that does is that can work out if you're walking, if you're running, if you're cycling, using various bits of code. This then is all the little tracks that basically ping backwards and forwards between the phone and a server to tell where you are at a particular point in time. So this is in Paris. And you can see, depending on how you display that as individual points or more aggregated together as like a heat map, that's either quite sensitive or not particularly exciting. So the fact that I spent lots of time at the Eiffel Tower is not very surprising if you're in Paris, is it? I mean, that's not particularly fantastic information. But the fact that I walked these specific streets starts to get a little bit creepy in some ways if you think about it, if you're not comfortable with that. So this is basically the information that a cell phone company already has on you. The smart idea around all this, by the way, is not to use your smartphone in foreign countries with this amount of data because you get a mobile phone bill which is not smart, okay? So just in case you're thinking of, I fell into the same trap in Sweden recently as well. So obviously I'm not particularly intelligent because I haven't learned from my mistakes. This is a colleague of mine, Kelly Dombrowski, who's a lecturer in geography as well. And with Kelly's permission, so this is Kelly's Facebook status. And what she's basically saying is that she bought a new tablet, and the tablet within a week or two has worked out where she lives, where she works, and that she cycles to work, and how long it will take her to cycle to work. Okay, so she's put the hashtag kind of freaky, which sums up that sort of creepy factor of this stuff is happening in the background, whether you realize it or not. So I thought that was quite a relevant example to point out that if you don't understand all the settings on a smartphone, Google, the cell phone company, Apple, whoever, has all that data and can work out all these things, can sell your data on for no profit to you personally, and all those sorts of things. Okay, here's my credit card data. And what it shows is that this is a city in the north of Sweden who I'm working with on a smart cities project. And what you can see is that I've basically geocoded, which means put a point in a place for the financial transaction. So I've been at the train station, I've stayed in this hotel, I went to this restaurant, I also went to the Co-op to buy some Swedish crackers. They're really nice, but they're quite salty, so not that nice. And also I was at the Interpool Sports Bar, which was a business meeting, if anyone asks. And so I watched Sweden lose 4-0 to Austria, which was very awkward in Sweden, by the way. So you can obviously get your location from your financial records. Has anyone ever got a phone call from a credit card company saying that we've detected suspicious activity on your account? Okay, I don't get those phone calls anymore. I used to, and this is the kind of the reason why. If you think about it, that's because the credit card company has a series of algorithms and bits of code that basically track what you're doing and then prompt a response from the system, okay? And this is me trying to get you to think about all that data that already exists out there somewhere else that you've inadvertently given permission for them to mine and to use. Mine's probably not a very good word to use. Okay. Anyone got Facebook? Yeah, okay. I'm going to call this the ubiquitous Facebook check-in. So on Facebook, you can check in where you are. You can also fake it. So I regularly check into North Korea, which has the unfortunate side effect of getting you pulled at American customs on a regular basis. Don't do that. So normally you have to be reasonably honest, but I worked out you can be in Burkina Faso one day, North Korea the next, while still being in New Zealand. So what I'm basically demonstrating here again is I've already given away my location and what I'm doing, as have a lot of you on any day of the week. So I've checked into the airport in Stockholm, I've checked into that specific hotel. This is my Swedish colleagues basically promoting the fact that I'm at their offices with their project. And this is the awkward situation here, this guy particularly, when Sweden were losing 4-0. So again, I've got all those places and I've checked in, or I've kind of made it obvious that I'm there. So here's where it starts probably getting slightly more scary. I track my location all day, every day, okay? And I also have a bit of software that tells me what specifically I was doing in terms of the mode of transport. So the green on this map is when I've been walking, and the red is either car or train or bus, okay? Sometimes it's slightly inaccurate, so this is not an underground. This is just slightly wrong, it should be up here. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is actually you're not getting that much more information even when you're monitoring me all the time. So you could still already work out that I stayed in that hotel, that I went to this bar and this restaurant, I was at that train station. This one was the local government, hospital, office, university. And so there's not that much more information, but it's kind of slightly more scary that you knew I went that specific route, okay? This is where the opportunity starts to come out though as well, because by knowing my specific route, I can remember that this was the main road here. And so I walked up to the hospital and down to the offices, and then I thought, I don't want to walk near car pollution, car fumes again. So I walked through some green space on the way home. And if you start to think that if every single person in a city was contributing a data set and these kinds of things start coming out, then the local council could plan footpaths through green space to get all of us away from main roads. And that's where the opportunity, in my mind, starts to really come out. So you can change your route. It might suggest that you go through the park instead of by the road. This then is an entire year of my movements, and this is starting to get much closer to home. So I'm not putting time and dates on this, but this is the entire year of my movements around Christchurch. So this one here is everything. Every time I've been in the car, in a bus, taxi, whatever. And so up here, can anyone guess what that is? This blue squiggle up there? Anyone want to shout out an answer? Yeah?
McLean's Island.
McLean's Island, okay. So this is when I've been cycling up at McLean's Island. And so you can see that there's a specific track that I've been around. These then are zoomed in on University. So you can see that I always cycle mainly up Clyde Road, sometimes up Island Road. Generally, I end up at work, which is a positive thing for my employer. And sometimes I go down the cycle path this way, whatever it happens to be. If you get this from everyone or a large proportion of the population, which I'll talk about in just a second, then you can work out where people actually cycle and put proper infrastructure or paths or whatever it happens to be. This then is me walking around. These little green tentacles here, by the way, are me avoiding University car parking charges by parking on Prairie Street, okay? And so again, you can see the patterns over time that I'm consistently walking roughly to the middle of Prairie Street to park. So if you see a car in the middle of Prairie Street, that's probably my car, okay? You just have to work out which one it is. And then this is the farmers market. So I've obviously spent quite a bit of time on Saturday mornings at the farmers market in Riccarton Bush. I don't actually think this is that scary from the point of view that I don't think anyone in the room can work out where I live from any of these particular slides. You can work out where I work, but if you look on the website, you would know that anyway. So it's not actually that disclosive, hopefully. Or I'll find out afterwards, I guess, in a couple of weeks if it is. So yeah, this is a map of all the devices in Christchurch, Internet of Things. So this website is called Thinkful, not F-O-O-L, F-U-L. That's my accent again. And so the different circles denote different devices. So it might be a weather station, it might be an air quality egg, which is measuring pollution, it might be a Raspberry Pi, whatever it happens to be. And you can go on and get the data from each of these devices for free and then use that to start to do research on whatever you think might be useful. The key questions with this stuff are around, can we actually trust the data? So usually there's enough information on here to work out that the device hasn't been active for a year, so it's probably not worth looking at. Or the measurements are so far off, anyone can kind of work out that that's not right. But the general answer is we can use a lot of this data to supplement what we already have from government sources. This is kind of the bottom-up sensing cities approach. Not that everyone's fallen over, but that it's coming from citizens upwards. Okay, so to summarize this section, again, depends who you ask whether you think it's an opportunity of a threat or a threat. Hopefully I've convinced you that there's much more positive that can come out of this than negative, although I'll probably not have convinced all of you. The key questions then are who actually owns the data that you're inadvertently providing, and who do you trust with your data? Would you rather trust a local council with that data, or do you trust a large multinational? Did I really agree to participate? Someone told me recently that if you actually read all the terms and conditions that you had signed up to on any given year, it would take 3 months. So there is absolutely no way that you could actually fully understand assuming that you don't even have a legal background to begin with, what you're really signing up to until you see it in front of you. Okay, so that's what I've tried to do here a little bit, is to push some of that in front of you. The key argument in this space, I think, is to recognize that there are legitimate privacy concerns, but also that there's the opportunity for real social and economic good to come out of this kind of stuff. And the critical sort of backlash against a lot of the smart cities approaches has really only just started in earnest. So there's still a lot of work to be done in working out, is the balance too far one way or the other? Interestingly, the patients that we recruited, it seems to be the case that we are more concerned about their privacy than they are. So we seem to be the people who are overly cautious. So the patients seem to take the view that because there is a benefit, broadly speaking, they're happy to surrender their location data. Okay. So the third part of this talk then is about trying to talk about a practical example that's happening here in Christchurch, which tries to answer the question, and this is still ongoing, so it's early days yet, about can all these sensors and data and all that technology actually make a difference to individual health, to the health of a population even? So what I'm going to do is to talk about one project in specifically, a health pilot project, but also to highlight that there's other work going on in Christchurch around cycling. So there has been a cycling application developed for mobile devices, and the idea there is that people can choose to contribute their cycle tracks to a larger database, and then that can be given to the city council to work out where people are actually cycling. So other applications that are more commercial, something called Strava, you have to pay per user to get the data. This would be essentially free to the users and to the council. If you're particularly interested in cycling, a colleague of mine, Professor Simon Kingham, has done a what if talk on cycling, which you can see on the website. He's in the realm of evangelical on cycling. I'm probably more less evangelical, let's just put it that way, but still convinced that it's a useful thing to do. So let's talk about the health pilot project, and then hopefully you can see where the rubber really hits the road in this space. So the piece of marketing that was at the front of this talk was around this project. So we aim to be the first place in the world, and this is actually true, that correlates air pollution or poor quality air with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, in almost real time, and that's part of the key of this project. So we're working with an inhaler manufacturer called Nexus 6 or Adherium. They make smart inhalers. The Sensing City Trust, Callahan Innovation, and Canterbury District Health Board, which, as you can imagine, with that many parties involved, it takes quite a lot of effort to work out which direction everyone's heading. For those of you who don't know, COPD is essentially a respiratory disease where the little sacs in your lungs start to collapse together. And again, as you can imagine, that makes breathing quite difficult and leads to flare-ups. That then leads a lot of these people into hospital, which then costs about $7,700 per time. So the ability to stop these people ending up in hospital would be really useful, not just from a cost perspective, but also from a quality of life perspective. If you could intervene early enough to stop hospitalization. So that's where this innovative approach comes from. So here's the statistics again, just to remind you as to why this is important. So 1 in 15 people are affected. Takes up 2 full hospital wards in Canterbury every winter. 4th largest cause of death, and takes up just a bit more than 4 days of hospital bed time every time someone has an exacerbation. Traditionally in health geography, and I love maps, but I'm also colorblind, so red-green maps are great fun. So I just like making wild aspersions about what's going on. So here in the darkest reds, which you can just about see, are basically the places where people are having lots of exacerbations of COPD. So that's where these people are coming from. This data is incredibly out of date, but even if you draw this map now, the picture is roughly the same. It kind of follows deprivation, which is a measure of social and economic disadvantage. So generally in the east of Christchurch and places like Addington, for example. So what we want to do is improve on this, which is the more traditional health geography approach. So you basically do this every year, maybe every month if you're particularly lucky, and that's not very often for the patients in particular. And then we wanted to link that to air pollution, if you remember. So at the minute in Christchurch, there's 2 air quality monitoring stations, one in St Albans and one in Woolston, and that's it, basically. So if you want to link anything to air quality, you have to basically assume that they're either one or the other. This map is basically like a reasonably complex statistical model of those 2 sites and a few other things. So the darkest colours are where the highest air pollution is, which is basically in the middle of Christchurch, and it gets less as you go outwards. And of course, if you assume someone lives here, you assume that their air pollution is basically always low, which is not really very realistic because people, believe it or not, move around, usually at some stage. And so we wanted to improve on this approach. Now, excuse this particular hypothetical individual for all you national voters out there. What we could do to improve on that approach is actually to make this hypothetical individual move around and accurately assign their exposure to pollution. Okay, so let's call this person John. Okay, I've racked my brain for a name, but we'll stick with John. And we can use a mobile app to get his location. Okay. How does John's pollution exposure actually change now as he moves around the smarter city? So John away goes there on his travels, canvassing the doors. And we know now that actually he went this particular route. And so we know he went kind of low, medium, high, so on and so forth. So we can now start to work out that actually it wasn't always low pollution. It was a mixture of various things at different times of the day. What we want to do really is to start plonking out lots and lots of sensors which are reasonably accurate, or at least give us an indication of where air quality is. So this is badly spelt humidity, luminosity, noise, and temperature. Okay, this comes from America. I'm not sure if humidity is spelt different in America. I didn't think so, but there you go. So you get real-time feeds, essentially, of all this data. And what the flat line here is when the solar panel stops working. Okay, so that was a failure. We had a go, it didn't work out. So you need these things to be on all the time. So I had to backtrack a little bit and go for higher quality, higher cost sensors. So the key thing is actually that it's switched on all the time. Otherwise the whole thing sort of falls over. But basically the idea now is that we have better quality data coming out and we can make a better model of what the reality might be. So this time our friend John is much, much happier as he moves around, because we now know that his risk looks like this. Okay, so yellow is kind of medium, green, good, red, bad, crudely speaking. Okay, so this time we now know where and when the pollution is higher. So of course that might go up and down during the day, and then we can accurately pin that on John. And this time, of course, we've involved air quality sensors. So that's basically the big step forward, if you can imagine that as John moves around, then we can actually start to tack his risk on and then look at his clinical data and find out if there's any relationship between the amount of pollution he's experiencing and the clinical data. Okay, thanks, John. Okay, so I would argue that's a smart step forward, and it helps us to understand more of the scientific puzzle, if you like, around that particular problem in health geography. So instead of a static, i.e. an annual or a monthly update, we can now get close to real-time information on patients, which gives us a more realistic risk profile. And we can also start to understand if the environment is actually important at all. And even if it turns out that it isn't, we have a better map of air quality, as well as other things like noise, which of course is a problem if you live somewhere like Riccarton around lots of students who are very quiet, then that is the problem with noise. Okay, that was a joke as well. Okay, so wrapping up the talk, hopefully I've given you these reasonably satisfactory answers, although I should have thought more carefully about the questions to give myself an easier ride. What is a smart city? It depends who you ask, who you are and where you're coming from. Is the smart city more of an opportunity or a threat? I would argue it's much more of an opportunity, with the caveat that it matters the specific context, who has the data, all those things. And could a smarter city improve your health? Well, yes, actually, I think there's a real opportunity there that it could. So I'm going to finish with a few final thoughts. And these are ponderings that I haven't found a definitive answer to just yet, so I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. What do you really mean whenever you say smart? Do you mean including the word smart in front of what you're doing anyway, or do you mean an actual change? And are we really solving the big issues that society faces? Or are we only solving problems that have a smart solution? What about those problems that cannot be solved by these kinds of approaches? And that's where my kind of more academic, critic and conscience sort of role steps into it, thinking more philosophically. I'm going to steal a quote from an American president. John F. Kennedy said, gross national product, or measures like GDP, which measures everything that happens in the economy, measures absolutely everything except those things that make life worthwhile. So I'm going to try and slightly plagiarize that quote, and if you're a student, never do this. I would argue, so this is me tonight, the danger is that smart cities actually, when not strongly influenced by the citizens of that city, could measure anything and everything except that which really matters. And so with that, I finish. Thank you very much.